Hello and welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Rebecca Rose. In today's episode, we discuss navigating the road to SmallSat compliance. We hear from aerospace experts Barbara Braun and Sam Sims on their newly released paper, Navigating the Policy Compliance Roadmap for Small Satellites. Listen to Colleen Stover from the Center for Space Policy and Strategy ask about the complexity of policies in determining ownership and accountability of the many and growing number of small satellites. Also, how good small sat regulation and policy can help lessen the space debris now and in the future. Let's get started, and over to you, Colleen.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca. And today I'm very glad that we have both Sam and Barbara here to talk about a recent paper that they've just researched and published with Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here.
So I have an advanced copy of the paper, Navigating the Policy Compliance Roadmap for Small Satellites. You were each an author of that, as well as Aaron Zuckerman. And I want to kind of take today and talk about some of your findings, some of your research. And I love the title, Navigating the Roadmap. But there has been a large proliferation of LEO satellites, small satellites. We have large and mega constellations that are being launched now and processed by a lot of commercial companies, as well as ones planned for in the future. And so the small satellite industry is really taking off. And so I really appreciate that you guys were able to do this paper now. Is it true that this is a redo, right? You're actually updating a previous paper?
Yeah, that's correct. It's we first released this a few years ago, and with, as you say, the proliferation of small satellites and proliferated constellations and so forth, we were asked to take another look at it. There's also been some policy changes in that time, so we re-updated the paper to reflect those.
Okay, well, Barbara, why don't you give us a little overview of some of the policies that are governing the satellites and their launch vehicles right now?
Yeah, well, and one of the first things that we talk about in the paper is that the first thing you need to do is figure out who actually owns the policy or who actually owns the satellite or the launch vehicle in question, and whose policy you need to follow. And you could think that if you're launching a single satellite on a single rocket and one agency owns both, then that's not really a big deal. But if you've got, say, a commercial rideshare integrator with a dozen satellites, all from different agencies, it becomes a lot more complicated. So first we try to figure out who owns the launch, who owns the rocket. And there's this kind of natural demarcation line from the point of the spacecraft being separated from the launch vehicle. So the launch vehicle owner or provider owns that rocket all the way up until the point of satellite separation. And then those satellites fall under the policy guidelines of their owning organizations. And then you kind of have the question of, well, who is the owning organization of a particular satellite? If the government pays a contractor to build this satellite, then are they the owning organization or is the contractor the owning organization? And usually we say is the best way to figure this out is to ask who makes all the decisions for this satellite? Who could decide, for example, that the mission is over or that we need to shut down and deorbit at this point? It doesn't matter if the government is paying contractors to build or fly the satellite. If the government is the one making all the decisions for that satellite, then it's a government-owned satellite and it falls under the policy regulations of the government. If it's a commercial entity that owns that satellite and controls all the operations and decides what's done with the data from that satellite, then it's a commercially owned satellite, even if, for example, the government might buy that data.
What's an example?
Like in the paper.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've tried in the paper to outline various scenarios and put flow charts so that you can walk through and see examples of how you might determine who owns the satellite.
Yeah, so there is actually some great graphics in the paper. We might be able to share some of those to our audience while we're talking. But Sam, give us some examples of what a kind of kind of Frankenstein launch would look like who has the launch vehicle, what are some examples of these ride shares? There's international launching going on, even US government things are being launched on
Right.
foreign soil. So how does, yeah.
So the best example that Barbara and I have experience with is a mission that was launched in 2019 called STP-2. There were 20 plus satellites on that rocket. The rocket was bought for or owned by the Space and Missile Systems Center, but none of the spacecraft that were actually on that launch vehicle were Space and Missile Systems Center spacecraft. There were 6 that came from Taiwan. There were some that came from NASA. There were some that came from colleges and universities. There was some that came from labs, national labs or DoD labs. So it was a giant mix of organizations. There was a lot of cat herding, making sure everybody was following the policies they should follow and determining what those policies were, which were things that applied to everybody, which were things that only applied to the foreign spacecraft, which were things that applied to the NASA, which were things that applied to the DoD, things like that. And it basically comes down to what Barbara said, is you have to determine who has satellite control authority, and that's the organization for which they have to follow all of their policies.
Right. So after that satellite maybe has concluded its mission, for example, who decides when it's okay to deorbit it?
Correct. Or turn it off,
Right.
Move it to a parking orbit, things like that.
Right. And so, there's this so many more small satellites going up there. Let's talk debris. Barbara, I know that you have some experience with debris. So what are the many ways that debris could be generated, for example? Let's just kind of walk our audience through a couple scenarios just to let them know.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. Some debris is just leftover stuff, satellites that are beyond their operational life and have been decommissioned but are still in orbit, or even rocket bodies that are left over upper stages from launches that happened years and years ago, created over about 2,000 pieces of trackable debris, or even from natural breakups of old satellites or from explosions of old fuel tanks and so forth.
Well, so what can we do to start trying to mitigate that when we have, in terms of policies and stuff like that?
Yeah, well, for the US, we have a set of guidelines that are called the Orbital Debris Mitigation Standard Practices, or sometimes called the ODMSP. These guidelines are meant to apply to all US-owned and launched spacecraft, whether they're government-owned or commercially owned. And these lay out the sort of practices that people may be familiar with that help mitigate all of these types of debris-generating events. So, for example, they regulate how long you can stay in orbit after your mission has ended before you need to move to either a disposal orbit or to re-enter the atmosphere in order to get out of active orbits. And they also regulate, for example, what is the highest probability of collision that you might have, of accidental collision, with the debris environment that's currently out there. And that's to try to reduce these collisions that create more debris, which then could create more collisions that would create more debris until we get into kind of a negative accelerating cycle. They also have regulations about, for example, the probability of explosion that you have to stay underneath. So if you've got a pressure vessel or batteries, anything that's possible for possibly generating an explosion either through buildup of pressure or through overheating, then you have to show that there are enough controls on those pressure vessels to keep accidental explosions from happening, again, to within a certain threshold that's listed into these guidelines. But, the interesting thing is that these are guidelines. They aren't laws or regulations, and the enforcement of these guidelines is left to the agency that owns the satellite. So like earlier, we talked about the fact that a commercial satellite launched on an Air Force rocket doesn't necessarily follow Air Force guidelines. It follows commercial guidelines. And for example, for orbital debris, those guidelines are actually enforced by the Federal Communications Commission, because the FCC will not grant satellite a license on the frequency spectrum if they don't prove that they are adhering to these guidelines. If you're a NASA satellite, then you have your own process for demonstrating compliance with the orbital debris mitigation standard practices. Same thing with the DoD. So this is where we start getting into this question of how do we determine and how do we enforce for a variety of different satellite providers the types of mitigations that are generally applicable, but which in some cases are left to the lower level agencies to enforce.
Sam, did you have anything to add? Did you have examples that you can share?
Well, just to start going on to the communication, like Barbara touched on, is that if you are going to do any kind of talking to your satellite, have a radio on board, communicate with it in any fashion, you do have to go out and you have to work through the process designated for your owning agency in order to get those approvals. If you are a government spacecraft, NASA, DoD, you have to go through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. And if you are non-government, you have to go through the FCC, like Barbara stated. And each of them have various different policies, things you have to prove, things you have to show. Depending on if you're an experiment, you have to prove different things versus if you are operational, depending on what you're trying to do with those frequencies. There's also international implications, and you have to register with an international organization.
Right. Well, so you're talking about spectrum and FCC licensing and stuff. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What I know that your paper talked about some gray areas being in those spectrum policies.
Yeah, one of the gray areas that we have encountered multiple times, and currently I still see no fix for it, is the service academies, like the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, Naval Postgraduate School. Those are organizations that are academic or educational organizations. Some of them, like the Naval Academy, have their own amateur ground station that is fully approved and vetted through the FCC. But they are also considered a DoD organization and therefore can't or shouldn't use amateur frequencies, and they would have to file all of their approvals through the NTIA. So they get stuck in this middle ground of, well, I need the FCC to make approvals because I'm using an amateur frequency in an amateur ground station, but I'm a DoD entity, so as soon as I go to talk to the FCC will tell me, go talk to the NTIA. Then when I go talk to the NTIA will say, well, go talk to the FCC because I don't deal with anything with amateurs. And so what the Naval Academy has ended up doing is trying to work both sides and get both organizations maybe on a phone call together and explain the situation and see how best we can work through it. But where the struggle comes is that they are two organizations in two different parts of the government. There's not really a common organization that you could go to say, how do I make these two organizations work better together? And each has their own areas that they are used to dealing with. And when a situation like this arises that is different, the system just doesn't know how to handle it.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely the gray areas when they don't even know where to go for approvals when they're being told to go to the other entity. So yeah. So just basically, it sounds like getting people in a room would be a good way forward.
and sometimes you would think that sounds so easy, and it can be so hard sometimes.
Right. Well, so yeah, the paper kind of goes into also, I mean, spectrum is one, frequencies, using frequencies is one way for communications, but there's also the laser comms, and that's kind of becoming a little bit more prevalent as people get used to using laser for communications. Barbara, did you have something? Can you say something about that?
Yeah,
about the
absolutely.
policies that kind of go into that as a.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, laser comm is a kind of a blanket term for optical communications, and it's all one radio frequency spectrum that we use, but we tend to think of communications as being done by radio waves or different frequencies than the same frequencies that we see with. But increasingly, because of crowding in the because of crowding in the radio frequency spectrum, and because optical communications offer some very high bandwidth, meaning you can get a lot of data down, they are very fast data links. A lot of agencies are going to optical crosslinks or laser communications. It's usually done with lasers, and that's why it's called laser comm. Now, lasers can provide damage to both your eyes and also to the eyes of pilots, for example, in airplanes, and to optical systems in space. So it used to be that government agencies and non-government agencies were encouraged to do this as well. They would register with an agency called the Laser Clearinghouse every time that they would conduct any sort of a laser firing in space. And the Laser Clearinghouse would deconflict the direction of that laser pulse, either from the ground or to the ground or between satellites in space, with everything else that it knew about, and clear it as safe. Well, if you think about a proliferated LEO constellation that's using this both for uplink and downlink and for crosslinks, it's going to become very infeasible for some agency to do a clearance for every single one of these laser communication devices every time you want to use it. So we're going to have to look into approval processes, and this exists right now, that there are different tiers of laser approvals for low power lasers that don't pose a threat to either the eyesight of airplanes that might be flying through, the pilots that might be flying on airplanes through this laser communications link, or to satellites that might be crossing the link with some sensitive optics. If you could show that your laser is lower power than could reasonably be expected to cause damage, then you have more of a free license to communicate. But we're also probably going to eventually need to make sure that our own satellites are robust to laser communications in order to make sure that that we don't have to go to a regulatory environment that regulates the every time that you want to have a crosslink between, say, a proliferated LEO satellite or proliferated low Earth orbit or a large constellation of satellites.
Yeah, that's a lot to take into account. So I wanted to move into a little bit of, a lot of these policies are, I think all of these policies, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but they have to do with orbits around Earth. And so, obviously we're shooting toward the moon and eventually Mars, where there's a huge kind of cislunar push right now in terms of using that space between the Earth and the moon and around the moon for other kind of endeavors, human endeavors. The Outer Space Treaty talks about protecting the moon and other celestial bodies from contamination. I believe your paper talks about how NASA does have a policy that interprets a contamination in a kind of biological sense. But of course, debris and collisions and all of that are also something that we should consider. So what other things out there, Sam, are ways that we can, either policies that could be developed for future or other sitting policies that we could use to kind of protect that space in and around the moon and eventually Mars?
You're right. There are policies out there and that have been there. And NASA just published two policies in July of 2020, but they all have to do with, we shouldn't be doing things if our humans or our robots or our vehicles go to the moon to contaminate it. It's a pristine or non-Earth-like environment. Likewise, we should not be bringing things back from these other celestial bodies that might contaminate the Earth. But they're not necessarily dealing with things like we deal with right now with spacecraft and outposts around the Earth, having to do with frequencies or debris or slots. Do you need to start reserving slots around the moon like you do in GEO for spacecraft to be? Do you need to worry about if a spacecraft is in orbit around the moon and it's going to re-enter in the moon and hit something? Do you have to worry about that? So I think it's going to become something like the Earth, where different organizations, and I don't know if this is going to be at a global level, at a country level, what it's going to be, have to come up with these regulations like we have right now in order to make sure that we are using this new environment safely. But right now, those policies and regulations don't exist.
Wow. Barbara, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, and I will say that, yeah, both the lunar regime and the Martian regime and the space between the Earth and the Moon, which we typically call the cislunar regime, are becoming areas for exploration and growth, and possibly the next big wave of new launches from a diverse group of agencies. But I do know that both the Air Force and NASA are looking into how to expand their debris practices from the local Earth environment onto the cislunar regime and into the Moon environment. The Air Force just recently has been reviewing its main publication on space safety to insert wording to suggest that where not otherwise specified, please try to do what you would do in low Earth orbit if you are not actually even in Earth orbit, if you're around the moon or if you are in this between the Earth and the moon space. And then NASA has also just put out an interim directive that's related to collision avoidance and these things like proximity operations that we also discuss in the paper. And that guidance, which will be updated into permanent guidance sometime in about the fall of 2021 or maybe the winter, they talk about the regime not so much in terms of the low Earth orbit regime, but in any regime where there is more than one spacecraft. So when they talk about their collision avoidance techniques, they're saying, hey, if a second spacecraft is flying around Mars, then you need to demonstrate that you're able to get out of the way, or that you will be able to conduct collision avoidance activities with anything that you might find around the object that you're orbiting.
Wow, so those are, you said that was an Air Force and a NASA, so now we just need to get the international players on board, right?
Yeah, that is true, and that's true for a lot of our, regulations. And one of the problems that we encounter with a lot of these international launches, rideshare involving international partnerships, is that the U.S. can write all the guidelines that it likes, but it can't enforce those guidelines on the foreign entities. However, we do try to all play nice. This is kind of a common ground for all of us. We all have to live in this environment. So we do have a lot of engagement through the UN and through international debris organizations and international policy organizations, where we all try to come up with norms of behavior that we can all adhere to, even if, much like we would do for, say, international waters and so forth.
Yeah, the norms of behavior conversation. Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot lately. And yeah, the ocean regulations, how we all kind of behave, in the ocean are good. It's a good example of how to do in space. But then, of course, I think about all the litter and the trash that go into our oceans, and I'm thinking, space. It feels big, but it's not as endless as we think when you're talking about orbits.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you say, it's we're all driving, even if space is big, it may be a big area, but it's got highways in it, almost like our shipping lanes, if you want to extend the ocean's analogy. There are orbits that are more preferred than others. And even if all of space is big, we're all kind of driving in the same traffic lanes. So, and of course, it's very difficult because people don't want to give up the control over their own assets in space if others aren't willing to do the same. But I think that there is an excellent international dialogue going on about policies more globally in order to make sure that, because it's in no one's interest to pollute our common environment. That doesn't necessarily mean we won't, but everybody needs to operate in space, and the big debris event or an issue with radio frequency interference or a problem with a satellite dying in place and then becoming a hazard to other satellites is a problem for us all. It really doesn't adhere to national boundaries.
Right. Well, so I don't want to I don't want to leave the debris conversation without talking about how cybersecurity policies. You talked in your paper about how cybersecurity policies and the rendezvous proximity operations those policies for small satellites actually influence how debris may or may not be generated. So can you make some, well, first of all, define RPO for our audience, but then make some connections that maybe were made in the paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So rendezvous and proximity operations is kind of a general term. And funnily enough, there isn't a really good definition of what involves rendezvous and proximity operations in terms of hard distances and so forth. But generally what it means is if you have, for example, a servicing spacecraft approaching another servicing spacecraft and conducting operations in the vicinity of another spacecraft. Obviously, we've seen a few of these types of missions launch. And if, for example, we wanted to do any sort of a debris cleanup mission, we would have to, by its very nature, approach these dead satellites perhaps and help deorbit them. So there aren't that many regulations out there governing rendezvous and proximity operations. And where cybersecurity comes into this is that there are also not a lot of regulations governing the use of propulsion on spacecraft. So, for example, a CubeSat, and in fact, there's some sense that ultimately any satellite that goes above the space station's orbit might need to have propulsion on board. Well, if that spacecraft has propulsion on board and it doesn't have a very good cybersecurity framework or a very good protection on its uplink, then you could imagine a hacker logging into this spacecraft and commanding it to approach another spacecraft and either investigate that other spacecraft or even run into that other spacecraft, or just to along the lines of a maybe an internet denial of service attack, just make trouble in space with its propulsion system where it could cause more debris or could cause an interruption in service or could otherwise do something adverse to another spacecraft. So a lot of the regulations regarding propulsion and the need for collision avoidance really have to go hand in hand with this need to secure our own uplinks and to some extent our downlinks as well. You don't want the space to be the next Internet of Things that a hacker can take over and use to, create an incident just for the sake of creating an incident or even with malicious intent.
Sam, did you want to add anything to what Barbara was saying?
What I would add is that where we're seeing this is that in the Department of Defense, you do have a lot of these requirements for being cyber resilient. Or if you're going to do RPO activities, you have to get things approved. But when it comes to NASA or commercial or academic or amateurs, those same requirements or more stringent requirements are not there. And so these scenarios that Barb just discussed could actually happen.
Right. And certainly, I mean, it's an added expense, right? For a lot of, especially amateur or commercial, with the data encryption.
And if you started, like Barbara said, this new regulation that's being looked at by the FCC to require propulsion on all spacecraft that are over 400 kilometers, that's an added expense that some organizations like academics are not going to be able to afford. There's some science missions then that those schools couldn't do because they need to be up higher. And they also can't, like you said, can't afford to put in all of the necessary, or even maybe they don't have the knowledge of how to make these propulsion systems work or the cyber systems work. And it just keeps piling on and snowballing.
Right. And yeah, you can outprice some of the great innovation that might be going on at the
Exactly.
university
So
level
then that's
and
the
amateur
question.
level.
That's the question. You have to find that sweet spot of being safe, but still allowing for the innovation.
Yeah, and I will add to that. This is where, tiering requirements, almost like we talked about with lasercom, if you don't have propulsion and you are below the space station orbit, and you are otherwise a fairly benign research and development satellite being flown by a university, not putting too much of a burden on that innovation seems like a prudent way to go. And then you can focus the effort on satellites that are higher up that need propulsion systems to conduct their own end-of-life deorbiting, who are performing critical missions, and work on securing those. And that allows sort of both the experimental community to conduct its mission without too much interference, and also protects our environment from adverse actors.
Right. Well, thank you guys. I've learned a lot. I learned a lot from reading the paper as well. But I did want to ask you, you both said so much about the different ways that policies, it's navigating the roadmap, right, for all these policies that affect small satellites. And so it was aptly named paper. But what do you think, and I'll start with you, Sam, what do you think is the most kind of pressing policy or regulation, something that decision makers need to be looking at immediately out of all of these things that you guys talked about? What do you think is most pressing?
So what I think is most pressing, especially for the small satellite community, is to work on and develop an education plan and or a handbook that is endorsed by the government that walks program managers through exactly what they have to do as far as policy and regulations are concerned. For the small satellite teams, they're very small and they're trying to move very fast, and they don't have the time nor the manpower to dedicate a person to policy and regulation the way some of the bigger programs do. And a lot of times they're new people in the space community and they don't know where to start. And it's all trying to dig around, figure out what they can, talk to people who maybe are in their organization who have flown a mission before, word of mouth, things like that. And so if there was a one-stop shop for satellite programs to go to and say, this is what I'm trying to do, please advise me on, I need to go to get a frequency approval, I need to get a debris approval, I need to do cyber and things like that. That would be extremely helpful for the small satellite community. But if that one-stop shop is instituted, it needs to be staffed properly, and it needs to be staffed with people who are knowledgeable and know how to work and advise, or else then it just becomes another piece of bureaucratic red tape that slows everything down.
Yeah, no, well, I think that we need to give small satellite operators your number, because this paper is the beginning of said handbook. So there's just a little bit of everything in there, including an entire alphabet soup of acronyms for all the different governing bodies, both nationally and internationally. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. It was, in terms of the red tape, there could be maybe a kind of website shopping kind of thing where you can kind of click, and it's not really manned by people so much as the information, all open source stuff is in there, and people can do that one-stop shopping, but online shopping. Yeah.
Excellent.
Barbara, how about you? What is the most pressing issue for you out of all the things that you guys laid out in the paper? What do you see decision makers needing to address first?
Yeah, well, I agree with Sam. I think figuring out the atlas to the policy navigation roadmap and communicating that, and kind of along the same lines, I think that there are efforts afoot. There are a lot of cross-agency teams doing this, but the more that we can make our policies match each other, that will help both in this coordination function of if the FCC's debris approval document looks a lot like NASA's, which looks a lot like the Air Force's, then there's a lot less confusion to be had. And I also think that we need to work on common sense regulations for debris and debris mitigation, ones that recognize that perhaps there are areas where more lightly regulated satellites can operate without causing further issues with debris, and also ones that regulate or that reflect the changing nature of space from a very few, mostly government-sponsored satellites to a lot of really commercially proliferated constellations. I do think that there is a lot of room for growth in the space sector. I think that's a fantastic thing. And I think that we have the technologies now to be able to do this safely and to ensure that we can continue to use space well from here on out. But we just want to make sure that we don't stifle the very innovations that have gotten us to this point as we start to develop these norms of behavior and these rules of the road, so to speak, for this whole policy compliance question.
Right. And of course, norms of behavior or there are debris mitigation methods that are kind of behavioral that can be controlled by policy, but then there's also technical solutions, right? So making some debris mitigation methods, being able to tell commercial or new entrants or commercials like, tell me what you're going to do to not create debris, and then see what they come up with, instead of stipulating you have to have this on your satellite, you have to do this and this, but just saying, tell me how you're going to not have debris. And then again, that's the innovation of, like, who knows, there's satellite tagging and all kinds of interesting things. So yeah, exactly. And the idea that good policy isn't solution centric, right? Good policy provides a framework within which we can innovate solutions. And I think that's really, as we kind of move forward, and rightly so, technology will almost always outpace policy because it moves really fast, and really good policy requires deliberation. As we try to keep up with the pace of change of technology, if we can just keep in mind those what makes a good policy in terms of not being solution centric, allowing for innovation, but also protecting the safety of the space environment for everyone. That's I think the biggest message I would send to policymakers. Right. So we know what needs to be done now. If they read your paper, they'll get some help on how to do it, right? And how confusing it can be for users. So any last thoughts from either of you? No, I want to thank you for having us on here. We very much appreciate it. And of course, we're always looking for feedback on this policy roadmap. Like we say, the roadmap is always changing. So we encourage those who read the paper to please contact us and let us know what's changing, what's new, what's missing, and we'll do our best to keep it up to date. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. And everyone go out and get your own copy of Navigating the Policy Compliance Roadmap for Small Satellites from Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Thank you guys again. I really learned a lot from this conversation. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you to Sam and Barbara for their insight and research into better understanding small satellite policies. Don't forget to check out their paper at aerospace.org/policy/papers. And thank you to our phenomenal production team, Colleen Stover, James Liggins, and Jordan Bingham. Check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow, and you can also sign up for the latest news and alerts at aerospace.org/policy. And be sure to look for our podcasts and share your favorite episodes with colleagues. We look forward to having you tune in to our next episode of the Space Policy Show, and until then, take care.